Hey, everyone should be able to see and hear us now. Hello, everyone. Morning. Got a good amount of people coming in, so we'll just get things started. Welcome to today's Cloud Talk, titled Microsoft Secure Future Initiative. We'll be covering some Microsoft security principles and pillars. This talk will be presented by Darren, who will introduce himself fully in a moment. I imagine some of you might actually be familiar with him. So quick note before we start, as usual, with these cloud talks, any questions, please use the chat function or the Q&A box to drop them in there. We will make some time towards the end of the talk to go over these in a Q&A section. So just make sure to type them in there and we'll come around to you at some point during the presentation. Also, this session will be recorded. All our materials are available on our WorkVivo page and the Cloud Training portal as well. I'll make sure to share those links towards the end of the Cloud Talk, as well as we'll conduct a poll and a feedback form will be dropped in the chat as well. Other than that, nothing more from me, so I'm happy for Darren to take it away.
Fantastic. Thanks ever so much, Sheriff. Hi there, everyone. Thank you ever so much for taking the time out your busy mornings to join us for this session today. Now, I do see a good few familiar names on the call, but for those of you that don't know me, my name's Darren Holmes, and I'm a cybersecurity technical specialist here at Microsoft. I'm part of the healthcare solutions team, so predominantly work with public and private healthcare organizations on anything and everything with Defender in the title, which I'm sure you can imagine keeps me certainly busy these days, given the volume of products that we've got in that space. But I've been at Microsoft for a little over 3 years. Prior to joining, I actually came from Bupa. So I used to head up the security testing, vulnerability management, and kind of threat response functions for BG UK. So whilst I haven't been as involved in the day-to-day operations as I once was, I've still very much been cheering on from the sidelines and continue to work with the Bupa teams on a number of special initiatives, such as the Azure Cloud Platform, and particularly working closely with the security operations teams. So Sharon and the cloud training team kindly reached out to ask if we give a bit of an overview of kind of security in Azure. But we thought that rather than focus on some of the specific products and capabilities, we thought it'd be a bit more prudent to talk through our Secure Future initiative and some of the kind of controls and measures that we've put in place to ensure that we maintain the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our solutions, and how some of those kind of best practice elements can and will draw parallels to some of your new ways of working through the launch of the Bupa Azure Cloud Platform. So, what is the Secure Future initiative and why is it important? So in a nutshell, it's a multi-year initiative to evolve the way in which we design, build, and test our software in a highly secure manner. So the initiative itself was kicked off back in November last year in response to having accumulated a plethora of learnings from threats that we've been seeing both internally in a small subset of our estate, across our customer base and across the wider threat landscape. Now, when we first kicked this off, our initial focus was around kind of the hardening of 3 key areas. So the hardening of our identity estate and increasing the identity-centric protections. Identities are still the primary attack vector, and ensuring that security of those is paramount to our business. Driving a more disciplined approach to secure by design, and how we write and test code and applications to meet high security standards. And then finally around vulnerability response. So ensuring that we provide a robust and transparent response to weaknesses that are discovered through our platforms and through customer engagements. What we quite quickly learned, though, is that this approach simply wasn't enough. So security tends to start at home, and we wanted to create a security first culture across our entire organization, and ensure that we had the right level of accountability across the full piece. So That started from the top down. So Satya Nadella, our chairman and CEO, he made security the top priority at Microsoft, putting security above all else. Over other features, over other developments, and actively embedded it into the performance metrics of all Microsoft employees. And Satya wants us to focus on two core outcomes. So creating a more secure, resilient, and transparent Microsoft. And that all of these learnings, innovations, and best practices that are being applied to the kind of development and growth of our capabilities, our advanced security tool sets, are then published externally to then help your organizations be safer when it comes to online activity. So all of our work across Microsoft is now guided by three core principles. So secure by design, and I'll do a little bit of a deep dive around secure design and development practices a little bit later on in the session. Secure by default, so ensuring that security protections are enabled and enforced by default and or through policy. So there's no additional configuration effort required, and these controls are not optional. So this is particularly where we're likely to see a good few parallels with the Azure Cloud Platform and how you're kind of using policies and guardrails to ensure the security of any future developments and implementations your end. And then secure operations, so ensuring that security controls are monitored and being continuously assessed and improved to meet current and future threats. Naturally, underpinning those three core principles, we then have our own security culture and various governance controls and processes. And again, to reiterate the importance of a strong security-first mindset across all Microsoft employees, we've implemented what some might call the ultimate behavioral incentive, compensation. So every single Microsoft employee, from myself to your account team, to customer service representatives, all the way up to Satya and his leadership team, all now have a number of security-centric objectives baked into our employee performance evaluations, and subsequently, it then directly impacts our annual remuneration. So then, beneath this security culture and governance, we then have these six core pillars that we've been putting extensive focus into. So protecting identities and secrets, protecting tenants and isolating production systems, protecting the network, protecting engineering systems, monitoring and detecting threats, and accelerating response and remediation. And then each of these pillars follow a continuous improvement model. So we leverage paved paths or industry best practices, particularly when it comes to compliance. And then these paved paths may come into our standards should they be seen to improve the security, quality, or compliance of a given output from I suppose whether that be from a development or a downstream operations perspective. So before I deep dive into each of these pillars and kind of the sorts of things that we've been implementing in each of these spaces, I wanted to just take a bit of a time, first and foremost, to go through a few kind of core security and or Azure concepts. So I feel it's kind of important to get some of that foundation to help frame the why behind a number of the technical controls we've been implementing. So first up is the shared responsibility model. Now, this is something you're likely aware of or may have come across before, but essentially it outlines the shared responsibility between Bupa and Microsoft when it comes to certain types of technologies and deployments. So needless to say, for on-premise data centers, you own the whole stack. As you move to the cloud, some of those responsibilities transfer to Microsoft. Or I suppose you could naturally remove the blue and insert your cloud platform providers where applicable. But for some examples in these spaces, infrastructure as service or IaaS would include things like your virtual machines. So essentially everything but the tin. For a platform as a service or PaaS services, these tend to be slightly more scalable, but perhaps slightly less configurable given the lack of access to the underlying OS. But this can include things like app service, or even Azure AD or Entra ID, as it's now known. And then SaaS is your more typical off-the-shelf products, such as Office 365 and the suite associated with that. Regardless of the type of deployment, though, one thing you will note is that you always retain the responsibility for your data, your endpoints, your accounts and identities. So this is naturally the sorts of areas where a lot of your security focus should lie. And I'll be putting some focus into those shortly, but first and foremost, I wanted to get you into the mindset of an attacker. So one of the benefits of working for Microsoft is I have the ability to use some of our intellectual property for elaborate metaphors. So in this case, Age of Empires, if we've got any fans in. But for those that are less into their computer games, please bear with me. It will make sense, I promise. So a common mistake that we tend to see, particularly with less mature organizations, is that they believe attackers will try to compromise an organization based on the security defenses that they have planned for them. Or they'll try to compromise an organization using the same set of tactics, techniques, and procedures that they always have. Threat actors tend to be intelligent and often creative individuals. So they'll typically do what anyone else would do by focusing on the easiest path of least resistance to their respective objective. As defenders, then, it's important not just to focus on the kind of strength of the controls, but also the effective placement and prioritization of them, and ensuring that they're kept up to date as the attacker tactics, techniques, and procedures continue to evolve. It's about ensuring that you have tried and trusted response capabilities to be able to rapidly contain incidents in the event of a preventative control failure or evasion. And it's about continually prioritizing, testing, and monitoring said controls to ensure that they don't degrade over time. So carrying on that Age of Empires analogy, attackers don't have an overview of your defenses and will naturally try and kind of navigate through the fog of war and use whatever information they have to then plan and execute attacks. So in this particular example, we look through the lens of a would-be attacker. They quite quickly figure out that an organization has next-generation firewalls, so they likely have intrusion detection and or prevention mechanisms and possibly kind of downstream DLP controls to boot. So directly attempting to attack or circumnavigate such defenses is likely going to require a significant amount of effort on their behalf, assuming the organization hasn't neglected their kind of software updates and configuration best practices for the network edge device. Sorry. The attacker then decides to get around these defenses by targeting IT administrators with phishing attacks. So they take a look on LinkedIn and other public-facing assets to ascertain those individuals most likely to hold admin credentials and launch a crafted phishing campaign promising those who click on the link the chance for a substantial salary increase for a similar role at another company. So they've made the assumption that IT admins access email from their privileged account and workstation, and that, at least for them, or at least one of them perhaps, may be tempted to follow a link under the promise of increased pay. This then gives the attacker control of the admin desktop, all of the credentials on it, including any and all the other resources that said admin can access within the environment. And generally speaking, if they don't succeed in getting admin privileges right away, they would typically search for things like password.excel to then try to exploit a common insecure practice for storing service accounts and passwords and other credentials. Once they've achieved said level of access, the next step would typically depend on their motivation. So they may steal, alter, or encrypt data, for example. They may look to disable systems or perhaps dig in so they can persist said access over weeks, months, or years until something more valuable comes along. So let's now look at how a defense in-depth approach and strategic placement of a number of controls could then help prevent such a scenario. So first and foremost, understanding your business critical assets and sensitive data repositories Ensuring that those are encrypted and that accesses are kept to an absolute minimum would have prevented this type of situation, or at least made it extremely difficult for the attacker. Enforcement of privileged identity and access management controls based on the principle of least privilege. So enforcing conditional access and other zero trust principles, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail shortly. Using separate accounts and considering the use of separate workstations when performing privileged tasks. Again, were this to be the case, the attacker, when the attacker initially sent the email, this kill chain would have immediately been stopped in its tracks. Enforcing rigorous security hygiene, so ensuring that patching configuration and operational practices are all hardened in line with industry best practices. And again, this is where elements like the Azure Cloud Platform come into place, whereby you'll have the necessary policy and processes in place to keep all infrastructure going forwards evergreen. And of course, modernizing security operations, so ensuring that your organization's tools, skills, and focuses aren't kind of myopically focused on one particular layer or the network layer, as the case in this example. So that there are the appropriate detection and response processes at identity, application, data, and other layers to ensure you've got kind of good visibility and a rapid response for modern attacks more holistically across the environment. Naturally, maintaining all of this can add up to a lot of work, especially when you consider the kind of downstream people, processes, and technology elements across the security lifecycle that are kind of required to then block or add friction to the attacker's paths. So this is where we typically lean towards a set of the design principles called zero trust to then help mitigate against these types of scenario. So just by show of hands on the call, and to make sure that I haven't yet put everyone to sleep, could you please click on the little raise your hand icon at the top of the Teams window if you've heard of zero trust before? And I'll just give you a few seconds to go through that. Good chunk of you. Fantastic. And now I'd ask you to keep your hands raised if it's a concept that you're fully comfortable with, you fully understand it, you know the kind of Microsoft approach to zero trust at a fairly technical level and how to kind of implement some of those controls. And a few more of those gone down. Oh yeah, getting a lot lower. Fantastic. Well, at least it means that this next part of the session isn't wasted. That's brilliant. So the first two principles in our approach to zero trust are business enablement and assume compromise. And they're all about setting up the right mindset by defining the overall problems of security to solve. So with business enablement, something that is quite often forgotten when you're in the throngs of low-level technical security controls, security is very much a support function for the organization. So absolutely everything security does should be within the context of what is important to the organization, their mission, their processes and priorities, and their respective risk appetite. We then have assume compromise. So you should assume that threat actors can and will attack anything and everything across your estate. You must assume that they will find a way through. And were that to be the case, what can an attacker do from there? What is the overall impact to the organization were said asset to become compromised, and what could an attacker achieve from that position within the network? And these first two principles should guide many daily decisions on security and how we think about kind of potential problems the business may face. And sorry, Robert, you still got your hands up? Is that a question there? No, just from the session earlier. Cheers. So moving on from that, we then have verify explicitly and least privilege. So this second set of principles kind of alludes to the control relationships between your assets in your technical estate. So these would typically consist of kind of end user and or system interfaces, which are then required to get work done efficiently. But these could also create risk by forming a pathway for threat actors that they could potentially abuse during the phases of an attack. So with verify explicitly, the goal here is to reduce the attack surface of each asset by ensuring that all trust and security decisions are informed by all relevant available information and telemetry. So because identity and access management is a core part of security, an important goal of this principle is to ensure that you scrutinize every access request fully and equally each time that it's made. So explicitly validating the trustworthiness of accounts and devices prior to them gaining access to resources takes a lot of the easy options off the table from an attacker standpoint. Then regarding the principle of least privilege, this is all about reducing the blast radius. So that in the event of a potential compromise, any unnecessary accesses and privileges associated with given entities are then stripped back, so that only the very bare minimum of roles and privileges are available there to that's kind of necessary for the respective asset to perform its function. Essentially removing all of those control relationships that I mentioned, except those are absolutely needed for the entity to perform its associated task. So let's take a look at zero trust architecture a little bit more holistically. And as we go through this, I'd like you to keep in mind those last two zero trust principles in verify explicitly and least privilege, particularly within the context of identity and authentication. So the identity itself is arguably the most important aspect of a given zero trust implementation. It's the primary control plane. It's also the primary attack surface. So for every single aspect, we want to constantly revalidate the identity itself. So that could be the user or a service principal used by an application, for example. We also want to assess the devices that these authentication attempts are coming from. So no longer do we just want to accept a given endpoint. So we need to validate and assess whether these types of devices should be having access to certain types of resources within my environment. So starting on the left-hand side, these kind of human and non-human identities require strong authentication, connecting from either personal or corporate endpoints, and the compliance of those devices needs to be assessed, and together, access is then requested. Now, zero trust policies, often referred to as conditional access policies, intercept the request and explicitly verify signals from 6 foundational elements based on policy configuration and enforces least privilege access. Now, these signals can include kind of the role of the user, the location and compliance of the respective device, the sensitivity of the data that they're trying to access, or the applications that they're trying to use, and so on. Now, in addition to the telemetry and state information received from the authentication attempt, a risk assessment is then conducted from our threat protection services. So this feeds directly into the policy to then automatically detect and respond to the threats in real time. So for example, is the authentication request coming from a known bad IP address? The policy is then enforced, so the outcome will typically be kind of allow, deny, or drop access, enforce multi-factor authentication, or possibly even blocking the account. And this happens both at the time of the initial access, but then is continually evaluated throughout the user session. Traffic filtering and segmentation can also be applied. So this will generally kick in before access is granted to the public or private network or any subsequent downstream resources. Data classification, labeling, and encryption should be applied to emails, documents, and structured data. And access to applications should be adaptive, whether they're SaaS-based or on-premise. So let's say, for example, you have an employee that is accessing sensitive data, or say perhaps in SharePoint or Dropbox, from an unmanaged or personal device. Now, depending on your organization's policies, you may want them to be able to have access to such resources so that they can remain productive. But you might want the necessary policies and controls in place to ensure that they're not able to download or copy and paste such data to the local device itself because it's not company owned or managed and presents a DLP risk. So again, thinking back to some of those zero trust principles, business enablement still very much has a large part to play. From an infrastructure standpoint, we want to ensure that runtime controls are applied alongside just-in-time access. So i.e. ensuring that there's no standing access to kind of underlying infrastructure, and that there's necessary kind of auditable governance controls in place, and version controls are actively engaged across those core assets as well. So if we look at this from a kind of scenario-based perspective and how zero trust and conditional access could mitigate against a malicious insider style of attack. So let's say you haven't properly configured your zero trust policies, and you have a disgruntled employee who's got a little bit of technical know-how, and they happen to have discovered that one of the IT admins had their username and password leaked in a public data breach. So the malicious insider attempts to use their credentials on a workstation in the office to access a powerful admin application and try and wreak havoc across the environment. Now, from a checks and balances perspective, for all intents and purposes, you have a valid user who is entering the correct credentials into a company-owned and managed workstation that's in the office. So it's the other side of all your physical security controls. And they're attempted to access some tooling that's deemed to be within the authenticated user's role. So unless you have granular adaptive policies in place, for the most part, this type of behavior would be allowed. With hardened zero trust policies in place, though, our threat intelligence has told us that this particular user's account credentials are available externally on the dark web, therefore raising the risk profile of the user. We've then seen that while it is a company-owned or managed device that they're attempting to authenticate from, it's actually not the one that they generally tend to use. In fact, it's the first login attempt that they've ever seen from this particular device. So here you could have a policy with which, due to the kind of perceived increased risk, you could adaptively request MFA for that particular session, therefore kind of ending the attack kill chain dead in its track before any form of access is granted. Obviously, if you didn't have that in place, you would also then have a number of downstream controls. So such as segregation of the admin account, which again would then prevent that kind of leak in theory. Privileged access controls such as JIT requiring approvals to access certain resources, and so on and so forth. So hopefully that gives a bit of an overview as to why that defense in depth approach is really pertinent. So moving those principles back towards the network, we need to ensure that we're removing implicit trust from within it. Now, networks should be designed in a way in which it prevents lateral movement, explicitly verifies every access request, encrypts data end to end, and detects and prevents threats in real time. So firstly, looking at this from a segmentation standpoint, a zero trust approach segments networks into smaller islands that may contain certain assets or specific workloads. Each segment should then have its own ingress and egress controls in order to minimize the potential blast radius in the event of a compromise. So by implementing segmentation, you specifically increase the level of difficulty for an unauthorized actor to propagate through your network, which significantly reduces possible lateral movement in the event of a compromise. From a threat protection standpoint, DDoS attacks continue to rise and attempt to directly overwhelm resources and bring down applications, as we at Microsoft know all too well. Externally facing web applications continue to be subject to a barrage of malicious exploit attempts through the likes of SQL injection, cross-site scripting, and other methods. It's therefore imperative that organizations consider ways of dealing with such threats through the use of load balancers, web application firewalls to drop or redirect potentially malicious traffic, and ensure the continued confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your systems. And then finally on encryption and hide, kind of aligning the assume breach principle, traffic between users, applications, and resources should always be encrypted wherever possible. So were unencrypted communications kind of used and an asset to be compromised, attackers would easily be able to then snoop and read all of those subsequent communications. And this is particularly pertinent when it comes to authentication traffic. So again, any and all legacy authentication methods that are still used within your environment, you should be really high up on your risk register, and you should be looking to eliminate those as soon as humanly possible. So from an Azure perspective, this is what some of our cloud native network security services look like. So at the initial point of entry, you have Azure Front Door acting as our modern cloud content delivery network. So that's got built-in web application firewall, load balancing, DDoS protection, so on. You have virtual network isolation, which can be achieved a number of different ways through physical or logical isolation. You've got our Azure Firewall with built-in intrusion detection and prevention systems, our application gateways, and of course, at a more granular level, you have your network or application security groups and user-defined routes. Now, one thing I would say about this particular diagram is it's quite good at showing the multiple layers involved in our defense in depth approach to zero trust networking within the context of a smaller single application. But were you to look at this more holistically, from a kind of network topology perspective with multiple applications, you would not want to put all of your deployments in that center circle. So in keeping with the last slide around kind of segmentation, you'd want to ensure that there are at least a few layers between each of those respective deployments as per your specific business requirements. So just to, I suppose, finish up on zero trust, I've included this slide to kind of highlight some of the common hidden assumptions of trust that a potential attacker could abuse within your existing processes and technical systems. So whilst I won't necessarily labor some of these points, down the left-hand side, you have kind of a number of common assumptions that are typically formed as information technology became more critical to business processes, but while security wasn't yet considered to be a top requirement. And then down the right-hand side in the blue, you then have a number of different strategies that are required to help kind of overcome some of those false assumptions of trust and then ultimately help to reduce security risk. The one that I will mention, though, is that security is the opposite of productivity, as I feel that this, again, is quite a common misconception. Security done right can absolutely be an enabler and significantly streamline ways of working. And I think that this much will be evident through the use of the Azure Cloud Platform for you guys, where, again, a great deal of effort has gone into ensuring that you have the secure foundations in place to then automate the deployment, policy enforcement, and a lot of the downstream kind of security controls that we've just touched upon through the zero trust piece. And with a number of those tried and tested principles in place, I then feel that will kind of help ease the burden and allow you to increase the velocity of delivery, all the while knowing that those newly created assets are subject to those automated controls going forwards. So that brings us back to the Secure Future Initiative and what we at Microsoft are actually doing in each of these respective areas. So for the protecting our identities and secrets pillar, we are actively protecting identity infrastructure signing and platform keys with rapid automatic rotation through the use of hardware storage and protection. We're strengthening identity standards to drive their adoption through the use of standard software development kits across 100% of our applications, including, again, those that are just internally facing and none of you guys actually see. Ensuring that 100% of our user accounts are protected with phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication. We're ensuring that 100% of applications are protected with system-managed credentials. We're ensuring 100% of identity tokens are protected with stateful and durable validation. And we're adopting more fine-grained partitioning of identity signing and platform keys. From a protecting tenants and isolating production systems perspective, we are maintaining the security posture and commercial relationships of tenants by removing all unused, aged, or legacy systems. We're protecting 100% of Microsoft acquired and employee created tenants, commerce accounts, and tenant resources to the security best practice baselines. Now, incidentally, that particular one has directly impacted myself. So as part of my role in showcasing some of the Defender capabilities, I was purposely, albeit very carefully, managing an insecure segregated environment, including a honeypot, so that I could then kind of showcase some of our detection and response capabilities, as well as our ability to kind of spot misconfigurations in an environment and kind of provide some of those recommendations back. That's now stopped. We have now got a kind of centrally managed and more governed and automated demo tenants for myself and some of my colleagues. We're also managing 100% of Entra ID applications to a high and consistent security bar. We are looking to eliminate 100% of identity lateral movement paths and pivots between tenants, environments, and clouds. We're ensuring 100% of application and user identities have continuous least privilege access enforcement. And we're ensuring only secure, managed, and healthy devices will be granted access to Microsoft tenants. Protecting the network. We're securing 100% of Microsoft production networks and systems connected to the networks by improving isolation, monitoring, inventory, and secure operations. So we're taking very much a micro-segmentation approach to 100% of our production environments. And then we're looking at creating additional tooling to kind of enable customers to more easily secure their networks and network isolation resources in the cloud. From an engineering systems perspective, building and maintaining 100% of the software assets used to deploy and operate Microsoft products and services. 100% of access to source code and engineering systems is secured through zero trust and least privilege access policies. 100% of source code that deploys to Microsoft production environments is protected through security best practices. Secure build and release and dev and test environments with 100% standardization, governed pipelines and infrastructure isolation. And securing the software supply chain to protect Microsoft production environments. For monitoring and detecting threats, we're maintaining the current inventory across 100% of Microsoft production infrastructure and services. We're retaining 100% of security logs for at least 2 years, and we're making 6 months of appropriate logs available to customers. So again, that extension from 3 to 6 months is something that directly impacts yourselves in the result of an incident. So 100% of security logs are accessible from a central data lake to then enable efficient and effective security investigation and threat hunting across our internal environments as well. Automatically detect and respond to anomalous access behaviors and configurations across 100% of Microsoft production infrastructure and services. And then in terms of accelerating response and remediation, we're reducing the time to mitigate for high severity cloud security vulnerabilities with accelerated response processes. And we're also increasing the transparency of mitigated cloud vulnerabilities through the adoption and release of common weakness enumeration and common platform enumeration industry standards for released CVEs. So as you can see, a hell of a lot of work going into that space. But I think just to give you a few examples of some of the things that have been implemented, which have kind of changed some of the ways in which our internal teams work. But to give you, I suppose, a bit of a better idea of the scale, I've got a few other examples as well. So as of March this year, we had upwards of 34,000 engineers working on the Secure Future initiative, making it the single largest cybersecurity engineering project in the history of digital technology. We've removed 1.7 million tenants and over 800,000 applications. We've enforced MFA across more than 1 million Entra ID tenants. We've implemented additional security layers for creating identities, including mandatory video calls between managers and employees as a result of identity creation. For the developers among us as well, so our Azure DevOps personal access tokens now last an absolute maximum of 7 days. We have rotated 98% of our production application credentials. Secure access workstations are now completely mandatory. And again, from a secure access perspective, all employees now have the ability to request kind of YubiKeys centrally. So these are the all plug-in FIDO keys that can kind of be used for secure multi-factor authentication. I'm sure that's shocked quite a few people, but yeah, it gives you a bit of a broader idea of the scale and exactly what we've been dealing with for this last kind of year or so. So, aligned to that Secure Future initiative, we've also made a good few changes to our software development lifecycle and practices, as you can certainly imagine. So I'm very conscious of time and that we wanted to keep 15 minutes or so for Q&A at the end here. So what I'll do, I do encourage you guys to access this link, aka.ms/SDLP practices or SDL practices. I'll also be sure that I share the slides with Sharon and the team, so you can go through some of them at your own leisure. But just to kind of go through a few of the highlights, and again, kind of aligned to the Azure Cloud Platform, ensuring operational platform security. Some of the practices in this particular space are certainly around the likes of enforcing MFA, protection of admin accounts, and I suppose respective actions through the use of role-based access control, secure access workstations, some of the just-in-time and just-enough access that we spoke about in the Zero Trust principles, implementation of security baselines, hardened policy enforcement, and of course schedule maintenance and automated patch cycles. We talk a lot in this particular section as well about the creation of network isolation layers and microsegmentation, and that using confidential computing capabilities to then further isolate sensitive data while it's being processed in the cloud is another kind of key to kind of best practice in that space. Threat modeling is another interesting one. So as and when you're looking at, say, migrating an application, for example, look to create architectural overviews and data flow diagrams and really question the specific use cases of a given application or ecosystem, i.e., how does someone interact with these respective services? What are the kind of business functions associated with this system, and what are the real world consequences were it to fail from a confidentiality, integrity, or availability type of standpoint? Last one I'll mention as well is that I've performed security testing. Now, again, for those of you that do know me from my time in Bupa, you know this one sits quite closely to my heart. So ensuring you work with the likes of Andrew Fernandez and co to ensure that you have static and dynamic application security testing embedded into your development practices. And again, as you start to move more towards an infrastructure as a code type of model with the Azure Cloud Platform, this becomes ever more pertinent. And then ensuring that, again, any output associated with those tools, you have a kind of cyclical workflow to ensure that, yeah, the output then makes its way back onto the development backlog. There's risk assessed and prioritized accordingly. So I think that's more or less all we've got time for at the moment. I think we'll move on to the Q&A section if anyone has any particular questions. Haven't yet had a look at the chat. Hopefully it's not too full.
Yeah. Thanks, Darren. And we will drop a quick poll as well whilst you're thinking of any questions. If you can complete that, it would be really helpful for us in planning future cloud talks. I think do have some links that I'd like to share with you all. I'll just drop those into chat. If you have any questions, you can also, if you're comfortable, come off mute. You can raise your hand and ask your question verbally if you'd like.
The microphones still appear to be blocked at the moment, Sharif?
I think everyone should be able to. Should all be able to turn
Okay.
on.
The microphones are okay. It's just the video's blocked.
Excellent. Excellent.
Okay.
Shy bunch.
Maybe you can talk a bit more about.
I'll go, Darren, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks for that. Good. Yeah, it's good. Thank you. Could you talk us through the DDoS attacks recently that Microsoft received and why there was such an effect and how that?
I don't have the detail to hand, but I'm happy to kind of follow up with you afterwards. It was my understanding that there was a configuration change that occurred in the background whilst the DDoS attack was underway. So our kind of failover sites essentially didn't kick in the way that they should have. But I've got the granular detail kind of behind that. I can send that over to you afterwards, Sean, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's great. I was just wondering because you went through some of that, the circular protection layers, and I'm wondering, if that's in place and we're advertising that as what's in place, how's it got through, and just interested around that.
Absolutely, and yeah, we've got a kind of full report and kind of breakdown of exactly what happened from a control failing perspective in that regard. It goes into quite granular detail then about what's subsequently been put in place since, both aligned to this Secure Future initiative as well. So
yeah, to prevent that in the future, then I guess. Yeah,
absolutely, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any more? What should we call it there?
Is there anything else you wanted to cover, Darren, if there's no further questions? We've got 10 minutes left.
I think that's about it. I'm conscious that the developed kind of security in perpetuity is quite a significant subject, talking about development lifecycle and all the standards associated with it. As I say, I think I'd recommend first and foremost going to that link around SDL practices. And again, we'll fire over some of the slides that contain some of that information. But I suppose, yeah, one of the key things from our standpoint, and certainly in terms of some of the what some may call a heavy-handed approach, by way of ensuring that kind of any and all Microsoft employees are then subsequently accountable for security from a performance standpoint, is making sure that you have the right KPIs and metrics in place first and foremost. So we actively work on things like mean time to detect, mean time to remediate, and how long some of those vulnerabilities have been active within the environment, and so on and so forth. So those are the kind of metrics that we'd be using to monitor the effectiveness of some of the programs. As you kind of work through a software development lifecycle, you want to ensure that you've got that in place. Even from a granular perspective, you may want to treat infrastructure-based weaknesses, or say encryption-based weaknesses, for example, in a completely different manner to, say, an application-based one as well. And that's one of the things that kind of you need to look at more holistically within the context of a given application or a given ecosystem, just to ascertain what actually works for you as an organization. But I'm also conscious that, again, whilst from a new development standpoint, having a lot of those kind of security testing methods in place, such as SAST and DAST and so on, for new applications, that's brilliant, and you can do it as you go. For a number of the legacy systems, or a number of systems that have been around in the environment for some time prior to the implementation of such kind of tools and processes, that's where you may accumulate quite a bit of technical debt, and there needs to be a pragmatic approach around how that's going to be dealt with, for when all are kind of aligned with the risk appetite of your organization. Yeah, I think that's it from me.
Amazing, thank you. Final call out for any questions from anybody before we wrap up today's session. Stunned everyone into silence, Darren.
I'll take that.
Okay, that appears to be it.
Great. Thanks, Darren.
Well,
Thank
thanks
you
ever so
so
much for taking the
much.
time to be with us this morning.
Thank
And
you, everyone.
yeah, don't be a stranger as
Yes,
well. My
Darren.
email address and so on.
Yeah,
Darren.
will do.
Look forward to hearing from you.
Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Darren, for
Bye-bye.
a great presentation.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.